Thank you all for coming to today's call to action panel event. Why are we here today? Well, the inception of today's event was for a film that I made. I'm a fledgling filmmaker. My name is Edie Defenbach. And the film is called River Take Me, and it's a very personal film, and it's a film that reflects on trauma, but how our past traumas impact and manifest in our relationships. So the kind of carried forward element of trauma. So today the themes that our panelists are going to be discussing, we're going to start with abuse, trauma, and then healing. So buckle up. So I will introduce our wonderful guest speakers, and then what we're going to do is we're going to have a quick sneak peek of the film, and that we'll have a pitch video as well, just to give you guys a bit more context behind like the creative vision and source of the film. And then after that, we will dive into the heady subjects that we're here to discuss. So, on this end, we have the lovely Adelaide Waldrop, and Adelaide is an intimacy coordinator, director, and theatre maker based in London. As an intimacy coordinator, she has worked on productions for HBO, Netflix, BBC, Apple TV, Sky, Stars, working titles, and various independent projects. No big deal. As an intimacy coordinator, her credits include the regional touring production of The Color Purple and Meet. She is a founder and co-artistic director of the ensemble devised theatre company Maud. And to my side here, we have Dr. Leonie Tansker. She is a lecturer in international security and emerging technologies at UCL and has a research interest on the intersection of technology, security, and gender. She is a member of the Advisory Council of the Open Rights Group, steering committee member of the Offensive Cyber Working Group, and former fellow at the Alexander von Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society in Berlin. And like your experience as a postdoctoral research associate for the Petra's Internet of Things Research Hub is, I'm really excited to hear about your work there. And here we have the lovely Naomi Alexander Naidu, a movement builder at Chan, a global nonprofit supporting survivors of abuse across borders. Chan creates open online resources and services for survivors that are trauma-informed, intersectional, multilingual, and feminist. And an experienced community builder for systems change, Naomi specializes in building networks and movements on social and environmental justice issues. She is an organizer with Postimapt and an advisor to Friends of the Earth's Own It initiative and the Make My Money Matter campaign. And joining us virtually, we have Alison Baskerville, or Ali. Ali was unfortunately unable to make it today because of snowstorms happening in Birmingham. But we're thrilled to have her joining us virtually. And Ali is a documentary photographer and artist, a former soldier turned artist. Alison has a rare insight into gender and conflict, and her work reflects on important contemporary issues such as gender equality, military occupation, female identity in the forces, and the long-term consequences of armed conflict. She's also a founder of a safety training movement called ROAAR, which tries to really put the female experience back into self-defense and safety and security. And unfortunately, Christine Clark, who is a transgender documentary filmmaker who's worked on the flagship BBC series Arena, is unable to join us today, but she sends her best wishes and thanks to you all for coming. Great. So without further ado, we're going to have a sneak peek of River Take Me. How does past trauma surface in your relationships?
It's a constant battle, isn't it, of going, okay, that was then, this is now. It's like a shadow of the past that you bring into something. And you can feel it when you're in the partnership from the other side as well, where you're like, I don't think this is to do with me actually, or to do with us.
We're made to feel so low by somebody else that you just think that's what's gonna happen here because you're convinced it's gonna fail. River Take Me is a really personal film. I wanted to explore trauma, specifically emotional abuse, but I didn't want to give any further power to abusers by writing or showing even a fictionalized version of them, and I didn't want to put a specific face to trauma. Visually, we wanted to capture how isolation and loneliness can exist in an intimate domestic space. The film works with circularity, repetition, and interrupted moments of climax to challenge the idea that toxic situations are easily identifiable and escapable.
We're really excited about the call to action incentive. The event will create a safe and empowering space to learn, connect, and inspire practical action to promote gender and non-binary equality in our homes, workplaces, and society. To find out who our guest speakers are, make sure to follow our page and stay tuned for extra incentives to go live throughout the campaign.
River Take Me is a testament to the power of healing through storytelling, and we're proud to contribute to the growing appetite of audiences who want to see more complex and nuanced queer female characters on screen. Just as important as the funds needed to complete this project is showing that films like this want to be seen.
Please join us in showing that queer and female voices are integral storytellers. You can make the difference to our success.
If you are unable to support financially but believe in this film, please help us spread the word by following and sharing this Seed&Spark campaign and our film on social media.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's just complete negligence. There is absolutely no way of coming back from this. We've got hundreds dead and counting, thousands left without a home, community with no possessions. It's complete negligence. Did you hear about the whistleblower?
No.
Apparently, that witch hushed up an internal report. Apparently, the findings on the dam's structural integrity was, well, it was damning. Oh, it's just... The infuriating thing is, of course she knew. But who's the largest employer in her constituency? The inquiry, and there will be an inquiry, will practically write itself. Just unconscionable. It's brazenly deceitful. It's just, and for what? All of those people who are now stuck with no homes, traumatised.
Why don't you do something about it?
No, I'm not going to.
What, you want to do anything?
No. You're being contrary because you're still upset, and it's actually quite a serious issue, so we can stop talking about it now.
Oh, I'm sorry. We can stop talking about it. Okay.
You're very welcome to share an opinion, Amelia. I'm always here if there's anything that you would like to share.
Oh, fuck off.
No, I fucking stayed.
Oh, I know. All right, believe me, I know. But that is your choice, okay? That's your choice, Liv. It doesn't give you a fucking free-for-all to make me feel like shit all the time.
Beautiful shifting of blame there, Amelia. Really effortless.
Dangle it over my head. Amelia, she changed her password. Dangle it over my head. Amelia said, right, so let's go left. Because why would you trust anything that comes out of my stupid fucking mouth? I'm so fucking sick of this shit.
Sick
Why
of this
does
shit
always happen to me?
Why does this shit always happen to me?
Stay and then
You
hate
are
me for
so
it, okay?
insistent
It
on
isn't fair. I
attracting
have already
on
lost everything.
Oh, I'm sorry you feel that way.
I didn't mean it to come out like that, okay? I'm sorry.
I will not let you shame me for
I know,
being a
I
good
know.
partner.
I'm sorry.
Your
I'm so-
mistake.
I know,
Your
I know,
mistake.
I know,
I don't
I know.
think you do know. Even when you told me, I didn't shout. I didn't get angry. That's your little luxury, Amelia. You're the one who gets to get angry. You're the one with tantrums.
I know.
You don't know!
Hello, hi. Oh my god, you're soaked. Come on in. Okay, bye. You want to talk about whatever?
I think that's a longer conversation than a 30-second lift ride, don't you? At some point you'll have good work.
That was
It's like, I'll take you.
No, that's a brother affection. Brother pure affection.
Cool. So that's a sneak peek of River Take Me. And with that, I would like to jump into maybe initial thoughts that brought up for you in terms of your work. Were there any bits that you saw happening in that dynamic between those two women, which either resonated with you or your specific area of work or an experience that you've had? And
It's rare to see the kind of presentation of a queer relationship that has its difficulties that don't stem from the sexuality of the characters but just from their relationship.
So that's yeah, I mean, so is there a misconception maybe that we have about abuse? What is abuse? Who are the quote unquote abusers? And what are the misconceptions that maybe you see that could potentially are perpetuating the problem by misunderstanding what is abuse?
Sure. So I'm actually, so I thought it was very interesting to see that dynamic play out, and it was also being said being isolated together.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm working a lot on how technology is being used to facilitate abuse. So whether this is smartphone, tablets, just the internet in general and the platforms on it, but also more kind of, forthcoming digital technologies such as smart internet connected devices, likes of Alexa, etc. And I think the phrase of being isolated together is something that we have seen in our research around COVID a lot, where if you envision like a lot of abuse victims were actually stuck with their perpetrator in the household. And fascinatingly enough, we've seen an increase of stalker being used because one issue that is being addressed in this conversation, in this exchange, is that one of the partners was not being truthful and was cheating. And yeah, we see a lot of technology being used in this kind of moment where perpetrators are thinking, perhaps this person isn't truthful to me, and they start to then like try to use technology as a way to check whether they are really like the partner that they are hoping to be, but often also to kind of verify actually the suspicions that they're having. And that's a vicious circle, because you may think it's a very quick solution to install something on a phone or check someone's phone, but it can go downhill from there quite quickly and spiralize out. And this isolation together, I thought, was a very reflective term of the kind of conversations we have with victims and survivors, and I'm sure you know we must have as well.
Yeah, so there's a kind of a theme of surveillance and maybe control, and that can be a spatial but also digital control, emotional control. But yeah.
Yes, certainly. I mean, I think, thinking about like misconceptions and misunderstanding about abuse, there's so many that we can speak about. And at Chen, we often talk about it in terms of like myths that are like really part of societal narratives around gender and relationships and sex and everything else. And I would say 3 like big myths related to abuse, particularly in a sort of intimate partner setting, because that's what the film's about. One, which was already been touched on, which is like probably the biggest, is that like abuse is always physical, and gender-based violence involves like physical harm. And I would say the conversation on that has like come a long way in recent years, but now increasingly people are talking about coercive control actually like more so, or before they talk about domestic violence, because actually coercive behaviours, which essentially just means like manipulating and controlling someone and using psychological tactics to do so, which are generally pretty much the same psychological tactics that people would use in like prisoner of war situations, or any sort of war situation, is often like the first sort of abuse that happens, and in some cases that then becomes physical or becomes sexually violent, but it might not, and it can still be as serious, and actually some of the like worst, most heinous cases of abuse that can go on for years and completely devastate, destroy people's lives, might not ever involve any physical elements. There's also, as part of patterns of coercive control, often elements of tech abuse, which we already touched on, and also financial abuse or economic abuse, which goes a bit beyond financial abuse, where essentially an abuser restricts their victims' access to different sorts of economic resources, whether that be finance, i.e. like you're not having your bank card, or you're not going to have your own bank account, or housing, or jobs, you're not allowed to work, and so forth. So that certainly is the main one. I would also say, just as a sort of odd add-on to that, that in the more recent discussions where people are having sort of more awareness about emotional abuse and coercive control and stuff, I think sometimes in the kind of popular narrative and social media narrative around this stuff, people like misuse a lot of words, and so like a word that has had a lot of attention in the last few years is like gaslighting, and that's something that initially I think like Love Island really like put a big spotlight on, which is actually like great in a lot of ways. Like it's great if popular culture can shed light on these like really real and serious phenomenons, but not if it's not if it then like weakens the concept or confuses the concept. And so gaslighting now is often used like essentially to mean lying. Like people just like say like someone was gaslighting when they were lying, and like lying is not a great thing to do. Like, you know, we don't want people to lie, but gaslighting is about actually trying to undermine, is using lying, but also other techniques to undermine someone's perception of reality so that they doubt their own sanity and thus their own ability to make decisions. Now, some people lie for that purpose, but you can also lie because you just don't want to tell someone something, or you're hiding something, and that's not necessarily gaslighting. Please. Yeah, sorry, do interrupt me, like, if I go on too much. So I think the second, like, big abuse, a big myth around abuse, which also relates a bit to this clip, is that, like, abuse only happens within, like, a marriage context or a situation where people live together. So obviously there is very sort of gendered ideas, and, like, statistically it is true that the vast majority of survivors of domestic abuse are women, and the vast majority of perpetrators are men, but obviously abuse exists between all genders, and you have perpetrators of all genders and survivors of all genders as well. But particularly people, especially the term domestic violence, people only see it in the context of we live together, you know, we're married, maybe we have children, and that is really, really, really damaging when it comes to people's ability to seek support, because if you are a young woman who's experiencing abuse, and unfortunately that is like so many young women, especially when we think about tech abuse and that sort of thing, loads and loads of women, you know, really in their formative years and teen years are experiencing these sorts of issues. They don't think domestic abuse services are for them because they're not living with or married to their abuser. And then I think the third just like big myth that I would highlight is what we think an abuser is. And I think again this is probably something that you touched in the film, of having it in a one in a queer setting, but also two where you don't necessarily have like one baddie or one clear baddie. And I think there is still a big misconception around like all abusers being like a very clear monster and someone that like everyone would obviously recognise as a monster and looks a certain way and maybe has a certain sort of power, which might also be because they have a certain status or they have access to financial resources or whatever that is. This is just like patently not true. Like anyone, and especially like with men, like anyone can be an abuser, and many people who do not fit that sort of model of what we imagine an abuser to be are. And I would argue that in the years since the Me Too sort of movement, although we kind of think we've come quite a long way in this, actually we haven't, because what happened post Me Too is I think that there was this sort of polarised narrative that on the one hand you had the monsters of like the serial rapists like Harvey Weinstein or R. Kelly, like the murderers like Wayne Couzens, post Everard and so forth. And then on the other hand you had the like an innocent guy who just like put his hand on someone's thigh or put his hand on the smaller woman's back, and then now you're not, and in a work setting, and now you're supposed to do that. And the kind of conversation post Me Too sort of polarised between those two extremes of these like serially like heinously violent men, and then people who just like were a bit confused and maybe making mistakes. And what that obscures is in between that you have a lot of people who are committing like serious acts of sexual violence, coercive control, domestic abuse and so forth, but are also people that are living like, happy lives where they are good people in other aspects of their life, have good relationships, are good in a work setting, they might be great sons and they might be great, friends and all of that kind of stuff. And like, and
there's
are
a
among us.
complexity about that, isn't it? Yeah. No, I mean, I think there's that, you touch on an interesting point, and it kind of reminds me of like representation. Which stories sell, which stories are picked up, and what are the kind of archetypes that are picked up. And it does seem to be that like, extreme ones will be, right? So the Harvey Weinsteins then become the poster boy of what abuse is. And similarly in films, you see representations of it's typically violent. I am reminded of Maid. I don't know if anyone's seen Maid on Netflix, but that...
It's on my watch list.
So that was, and I think Ali, you were telling me about Maid as well. So I think that's a useful a step in the right direction about showing how abuse and coercive behavior, or coercive behavior is also abuse, and also showing the difficulty and how the main character didn't recognize she was being abused, and as a result of that didn't think she was the resources were available to her. So I think I think that's a great and rare example, I think, of a representation of abuse that isn't maybe as sexy a sell. That's a really terrible way of saying it, but I think morbidly that is true a little bit. Like we do kind of gravitate towards the more extreme cases. But Ali, I'd like to bring in your thoughts on, because you work with women in conflict, or have worked in conflict, and also have experience as a soldier. So I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on any kind of maybe misconceptions of abuse in your field as well.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I'm not there in person. But I've thought like a lot about this subject over the years, not just as a safety trainer, but as a photographer, and someone who's been through the military experience as well.
Yeah.
And
Oh no.
Things, but can you hear me okay, by the way?
No, sorry, Ali, we're just trying to sort out a bit of sound, but
Yeah, sure. Am I just like...
keep on going. No, we can't hear you.
Back and we can hear. I mean, I can hear okay.
No, we can hear you, but quite low. So
Well, if everyone can hear Ali.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Okay,
Yeah.
we
Sorry,
can
Ali.
hear
Keep
you.
on going.
That's good. I'm not like the first example of sounds that came up, like background somewhere.
Very good.
Yeah, I was thinking about representation and that representation within a patriarchal system, which is reliant on heterosexuality really as being the dominant narrative, and what that also then does to say me as a cisgender woman in the military was about performing masculinity, right? So it was about sort of almost becoming quite patriarchal to survive within that patriarchy, and then the way that you uphold your version of safety or being safe is a very masculine approach to it, about being protective and dominant, and actually it's not that at all. Like a sense of safety is very holistic and very much based on your own unique identity. But I realised once I decompressed from the military experience how much I normalised quite misogynistic language and also being exposed to that form of abuse. And so the term like gaslighting is very prevalent in the military in a lot of ways, because there's a certain norm or a construct about being tough and hard and strong, and if you're almost made to believe that you're weaker or not as good as, and I'm sure you folks will witness this in other contexts as well. So I think when you represent somebody that's seen as different from the status quo or what people consider normal, you just get this resistance to it. And when I first worked on showing sort of femininity within a military construct, it was met with this kind of idea that have to be really highly feminized, like a sort of sexy with guns kind of image that the mass media were looking for, or they had to look really tough and masculine. So there's no nuance in it, you see. And I think when it comes to like representing sort of issues within a queer relationship, it has to fight all of those normalities that aren't normal, right, but they're sort of like the mainstream version of normal, to be able to show the nuance of, like you said, like a domestic setting when there's conflict in that. So, and I suppose I'm referring to the military and war because that's seen as like one end of a very wide spectrum, but it catches attention, it's seen as the story that people want to follow. So that's just my early thoughts. I don't know if any of that makes sense, but
No, that was thank you, and sorry for the technical difficulties. But so I guess off the back of that, then, so representation does seem to be a key thing in this, and what I mean by that specifically is like nuanced representation, the kind of representation that really does show like the breadth of experiences out there. And so, but I guess equally as important is, so on screen, in front of, public role, visible role representation, but then also what element of the behind the scenes, behind the camera representation, the decision makers, do you think in your respective fields, are we moving in the right direction for that? Is there an eagerness, do you find, for genuine kind of representation and inclusivity, or do you encounter maybe perhaps just paying lip service to it? So be interested to Adelaide. Do you have
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting and very complicated but very connected relationship, because obviously the stories that we see told are affected by the storytellers telling them, and I don't think that. I think there's a certain amount of, in my experience as a female crew member who's often in a very like male-dominated space, but not always anymore. I'm happy to say. What I think something that Ali said that really resonated with me is the ways in which anyone can adopt sort of patriarchal modes of power and abusive behavior and all of that. And I think that representation really matters, but also intention of artists is especially important. So for me, like as an intimacy coordinator, where I'm often brought in to sort of safeguard spaces, and sometimes that comes with a certain amount of creative input, to look at the language of intimacy on screen, to look at the way we tell stories about sexuality, intimacy, closeness, all of that.
We could have a whole, well, not just a panel, we could have, you know, degrees of like women in STEM, and like, you know, I think like a lot of also, I mean, I can't really speak about film per se, but like a lot of the technology that is used, I wonder if they're, you know, like, does everything that involves tech is more a techie, like male dump, like the camera, the cut, etc. I'm sure that must be the same, like when it comes to engineering, you know, there's, or just like actually medicine as well, you know, like certain more female tend domains of medicine are more like, you know, well, less paid and then more populated by females as well, and in engineering it's the same. And I was just thinking, you know, there's a couple things that Adelaide touched upon where I can see, you know, just the design of a film or the way a film feels is the same we feel how a technology feels. Just think about what you have in your pocket, which is probably your smartphone. And like, it might be super big and like not very accustomed to, for example, your hands if they're smaller or if you have a certain disability. So I think like just like a film, the way it is being represented, the way sexuality or intimacy is reflected in a film and manifests itself might be based on the design, the people that stand behind it. It's the same with the technology. And I mean, you know, there's dozens of research papers that showcase that, like, you know, if you have a whole team that is white, male, cisgender, and from a certain demographic, you get a certain type of device out of there that has certain functionalities and features that do certain things that have not thought about, like, well, people have a period, so we should put a period tracker in an iPhone, for example. That was a big case a few years ago. But like, so I think that is a really important thing. But also you touching upon like how women on the set may reproduce this kind of like narrative. We actually have a term for this, which is called the queen bee phenomena. So actually it's very common in academia. So rather than like kind of the engineering profession per se, but it's like by the time you hit professorship, you're probably so tired and exhausted that you just become a bitch, if I may say. Like, that's probably my trajectory. It's like, you know, like, it really like if you have undergone a university degree and you had a female prof, I wonder how you felt about her. I mean, I don't know if we have many engineers here in the room, but like, you know, it tends to be that they had, you know, they had to overlook the sexism that they encountered. They had to play the same rules by the same games. So by the time they hit professorship and are esteemed, they're tired and exhausted, and they kind of they forgot to lift basically the ladder down and make it easy. I'm not saying this is still, thankfully it's changing. But I would say my experience, especially working with like profs that are like in their 60s, now 70s, who are female, like I can see this. Like, and yeah, it's called the queen bee phenomena, because like you have surround yourself with like people that like help you remain the queen bee of the hive.
Well, and it's also, I think there's a certain thing that feeds back into some of what we're talking about with the film, is that it's the ways in which when you are treated in a way that is abusive or damaging or tough, and then you are in a position of power, there is a sort of, I don't know, a pattern of recreating that experience for those who come up underneath you. And I teach at my old drama school, and it's had, I mean, like many drama schools, luckily, has had a serious amount of upheaval in the way that it's teaching, in the way that its structure works, and its reactions to students. But you see that sort of phenomenon so much in theater and the arts, of the kind of like, well, like a sports mentality, or you know, without any experience, like what I can imagine a military mentality might be, of like, this was tough for me, I got broken down and I was better for it, and this sort of survivor, the self-identified survivor mentality becomes the fuel for an abusive practice of a younger generation, and then and on it goes and on it goes. And so in working to sort of acknowledge that and recognize that, how do we sort of break that, and how do people in positions of power learn to subvert that and stop that pattern? Because I think that is something you see both creatively on the screen in the film, but then also in the practices of so many different fields, clearly.
Yeah, well, you said, well, it's interesting, so it reminds me very much of what you were saying, Ali, about the kind of needing to adopt a more masculine persona and adopting those tools. And so it does seem to be that the cycle of abuse, there's an element of it where you're required to adopt kind of maybe more toxic behaviors in order to survive, though. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle. But what you touched on, Adelaide, segues really, really nicely into the next topic, the next theme, which is trauma. So similarly, we've talked about how do you identify abuse, how do you define it, what are the misconceptions, how do those misconceptions maybe perpetuate a vicious cycle, how do we, inadvertently adopt abusive behavior. So for trauma, how do we define trauma? How would you define trauma in your work? Should one define trauma? Is being too prescriptive? Maybe we're at danger of creating a hierarchy of trauma in the way that we are, with abuse, like physical abuse is kind of at the top and everything else is just, but at the same time, do we need to define something in order to fully understand and tackle the problem? Naomi, how would you, as being, the trauma, well, your charity chain is trauma informed, so I'd be really, interested if you could kick that off for us.
Yeah, sure. So, I think it's like a good question of like, should you define trauma in the first place? Because it's obviously like very like complex, and we would say like personal phenomenon, and that like it would show up differently for everyone, and it's not like a prescriptive term, but like I think generally trauma like would be understood as like an emotional and often physical response to danger or harm, or the fear or risk of danger or harm. So you can have trauma, trauma. You can have a trauma response to something that doesn't happen but is threatened, that shows up differently for different people, but would involve feelings of fear, of being trapped, of helplessness, of just anything bad, essentially. All the bad feelings could be part of being traumatized, trauma can also happen to entire groups, and it can even happen like across generations. So like you talk about intergenerational trauma of particularly like racialized communities and migrant communities and so forth, experiencing trauma also on the basis of things that their ancestors or their predecessors experienced. I think in our work we're like specifically talking about trauma from gender-based violence, and so that's a smaller category, but still it is really, really, really different for everyone and will show up in different ways, and people's healing journeys will be different. I think one thing that I would say is I would be very careful about the sort of conversation around, like perpetuating abusive behaviours and like abuse creates abuse, because there is that sort of trope of like hurt people, and that is and can be true. But there are many, many, many survivors of abuse who do not abuse anyone, and I think that it's quite dangerous sometimes the way that it's spoken of, because it becomes it can be used as a justification. And I like a really interesting example of this, which some of you may have been watching, is like You on Netflix, which has like the most violent, murderous abuser you could possibly imagine, and he is not, he's not portrayed to be anything other than that. But it also shows you how he was abused as a child, and how it was his neglect and abandonment which created this thing, and it's mummy issues, like no surprise there, everything goes back to your parents, all of that kind of stuff. But it, that show was made like, completely with the intention and the framing of like him as a violent murderer, and yet the perception to it and the response to it was often like basically people just talking about how like hot and sexy he was, and how much they wanted him to stalk them, and and also that came like from a lot of women. And also, I mean, he is a hot actor, so that probably didn't help. They got a Gossip Girl heartthrob, but still, it showed. Like I think actually they were trying to sensitively show the fact that he experienced this harm as a child, of course, contributed to him becoming this murderer. But like, you cannot justify the fact that he's murdering everybody. But in the response to it, some people were doing that and were saying, oh, you know, I just want to help them and harm it, and actually the actor had to like intervene and say like, stop saying this is not what this show is. And that just shows how like deep-seated some of these beliefs and again, like myths are in society and pop culture.
So that's, I mean, this might be a little bit more jumping the gun into the healing aspect of it, but one of the the character Amelia in the film, her trauma, her past trauma is manifested in their relationship. Amelia is the one in the black dress. But part of what I wanted to explore was precisely this, where you become a victim and then you attach yourself to this victim identity, and then what that does is you use it to legitimize like doing harm onto others, whether or not it's conscious or subconscious. So it's really interesting that, and I'm happy you brought up that point, that because even though we talk about the cycle of abused people then could become abusers themselves, it doesn't legitimize it, and it doesn't make it okay.
And it's also absolutely not inevitable.
And it's not inevitable.
I like the vast majority of survivors that and there's definitely also a gendered aspect to that.
Yeah.
But the vast majority of survivors that we work with are not abusing anyone.
Yeah.
They're focusing on their recovery.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But it's like escaping this notion of yourself as a victim, though, maybe is one element of kind of making that not inevitable, you know, which is what the film, one of the bits that the film was trying to explore. But Adelaide, I don't know if you've had any experience on set of needing to deal maybe with trauma that's come up unexpectedly, and how that's...
Yeah, well, my entire role was sort of created to mitigate against the risk of trauma and injury, and like the easiest comparison that I offer, just because I am the nature of having a role that is relatively new and one that is commonly misunderstood, is that I am always sort of advocating for my job as I'm doing it, which is a fun little multitask. So the sort of shorthand is like a stunt coordinator mitigates against the risk of physical injury or harm that can happen when working on a scene of choreographed violence. With scenes of choreographed intimacy, there is a risk of physical injury and harm sometimes, but the risk is more one of psychological or emotional injury and trauma. And what's interesting is that, so that's the health and safety element of my role, which I do work to mitigate against by ensuring that, you know, consent levels are protected, that they have a person outside of the power structure on set that they can talk to in confidence and who can then advocate with production on their behalf and say, this is exactly how much of their body they're willing to show, this is it in writing, here's the language, like, and then I safeguard that documentation on set. So I'm constantly working to kind of keep any additional trauma as far away as possible. But I also, I think when we sort of started off at the beginning, there is a lot about past trauma that can often be suppressed or forgotten. And so part of my job, and any intimacy coordinator will have like certain mental health awareness training. You'll be a mental health first aider and have trauma awareness training to sort of help mitigate against anything that might trigger a past trauma. And one thing that, because obviously there's personal traumas that people have, the sort of echoes and shadows of that I don't sit down with somebody and say, tell me everything, because I'm not a mental health professional at all. But I do sort of work to ensure that the actors that I work with, and also to a degree, like I work to protect crew as well as much as I can. So working to ensure that there are systems and protocols in place that help people, you know, make informed decisions about what they're consenting to be present for, even if it is just a sort of portrayal of something. I worked on an ITV series that had a lot of traumatic content. It's a sort of a gothic novel that discusses works. The lead character is a formerly enslaved woman, and then you've got sort of themes of a lot of physical violence and trauma, but then also like there was a scene that I was sort of consulting on of a character having a miscarriage, and I sort of spoke to production about ensuring that crew knew when those scenes were being filmed and that they had the option to opt out, because you can't with a 100-person crew, you can't go around and be like are you going to be okay with it, and people, it's difficult for people to sort of foresee that when they're doing their job and working in a completely different sphere than sort of engaging with any past trauma they may have. But one thing I do encounter a lot is also sort of past professional traumas. So oftentimes I have very much been an actor's first experience of an intimacy coordinator or an intimacy director. And in talking that role through with them, and it happens with directors as well, and crew and everyone, people will talk to me about what I do and why my role exists, and they'll start to remember experiences they had on set or in a play, and they'll go, actually, thinking about it, and then they'll talk about, something that happened, or a thing that in the context at the time, in the industry that they're in, felt like just, you sort of have to grin and bear it and kind of like brace for it and live through it, and then quickly after your brain compartmentalizes that trauma and puts it away. And then when something reminds you of it, all of a sudden that box gets pulled out of the sort of dark back closet of your mind, and you open it up. And so often I find myself, more than talking about people's personal lives and their personal triggers and traumas, which I try to avoid unless they need to be discussed, because again, it's not my job. But I do talk a lot about professional traumas that people have experienced or witnessed or have felt sort of complicit in or privy to, especially directors who had no recourse to know how to do this work properly, and then are sort of reconciling, having to sort of pull apart the ways in which they were perpetrators of unintended harm through the process that they created. So yeah, it's sort of everywhere, and it's about having a robust and multifaceted approach to mitigating any new trauma, and also having a system in place that can help support people as and when they need, depending on their individual experience.
I kind of want like an intimacy coordinator for every industry. I just feel like the kind of the bare bones principles of what you do, or what you just described there as well, and having, people recognize, oh, maybe I could have been a perpetrator of that in the workplace, especially, I think is really interesting. And Ali, I would toss it back to you actually, is for not just in the military but in conflict as well. I think when we read the news or see devastating impacts of conflict, we just think, oh my goodness, look at the violence and the physical safety, but my gosh, the trauma of that must be huge. And how do you feel that it's acknowledged as part of relief efforts or in your work?
I think it's something, I can't remember who said this at the start, but there's no such thing as like the trauma Olympics of like who gets more trauma than someone else. I think the way that it was described to me a few years ago was, it's like a tear in the fabric of your perception of normal. And I felt that was quite a helpful term to talk about trauma, so that you weren't trying to grade it as like, well, there must be more trauma in a war zone. It's not always true, because everybody is different and people absorb things differently, and you can have two people experience the same incident and have completely different responses to it. So it is quite unique to each individual. But one thing that I'm thinking about here in comparison to the sort of recent role of an intimacy coordinator is, it's almost around the same time when people started talking more about trauma and how it had affected journalists, and how there was very little conversation about resourcing journalists to work in places where they might be exposed to trauma with any kind of care. So editors and directors are kind of in a similar sphere here, as in not really considering vicarious trauma or direct trauma from the types of work they're doing. And I find it so fascinating that within the film world that people are trying to recreate harmful situations for the scene, to convey the story. So, and to be able to do that, you are exposing yourself to potentially some form of trauma to be able to do that. And that's the same as an editor who's sat looking at someone's photographs. They might not have been in the situation, but they're certainly looking at it from a vicarious perspective. So my point here really is that we should never assume that everybody has not been exposed to trauma, and say that I would assume that everyone has experienced some form of trauma, because how will you ever know? You know, like, we're not all mental health professionals. Even mental health professionals don't know that, right, until it's signposted to them. So the more emphasis we put on trauma-informed approaches to everything, not just films or media safety training, but to make spaces for people where there isn't that exposure, in the sense that it's created with care. And since we set up ROAAR, we've worked over the last 2 years to make trauma-informed safety training, so that we know that we might be exposing somebody to a situation that they may have experienced. Because in safety training, the aim is to put people into scenarios where they can try out what they've been taught, but they're also exposed to potentially traumatic situations. So that trauma-informed approach is kind of, I just think it needs to be in like all spaces really. It's very aspirational, but certainly I think it's possible, because as soon as someone walks through a door, you don't know what they're carrying or what they've experienced. So the more open-minded you are to how to create a safer space, and safer spaces aren't about excluding people, they're about making sure that the people in that space feel included and seen, and then that helps them to process whatever it is they're potentially going to be exposed to. So I think trauma and the realisation of people's exposure to it going back generations is something to consider in whatever type of work you do. I think it's and especially now, in the sort of later stages of this pandemic, you know, people are carrying a lot before they even come to work. So any kind of work that we can do to help with that is really valuable. So, and if you've been through a trauma and you go into that, and you've perhaps been through something in childhood, you develop an attachment style because you've kept yourself safe as a child. But what happens is, in older life, your relationships might be difficult because, you know, you have only ever learned how to show care in a certain way, you know, which might be problematic for you. You might normalise kind of difficult relationships or abusive behaviour. There's loads of layers to this, right? This is like a very long conversation. So, but trauma is like the fundamental, like, centre and cause of so many of these different types of behaviours. So I just think societally we have to work harder and with more care about the idea that probably every person we meet has been through some form of trauma.
It's interesting. We brought up, Naomi, you've brought up the kind of intergenerational trauma, and Ali, I think you've spoken about this as well, about how, you know, you then how that informs how you raise your, you know, kids, or just that carried forward element of it that's passed down. And I'm wondering, Leonie, given that we have a whole generation now who's grown up with a type of kind of digital trauma, online trauma, that I don't know that we can quite fully relate to in the same way, just in our based on, you know, not having grown up with those apps at such a young age. And I wonder if you know anything that's being done to yeah, that's Tink. She was gonna come. Stealing the show, Tink. Stealing the show. But yeah, I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that, and how to maybe have more trauma-informed approaches to how we develop or use digital spaces.
So I think, like, from a research perspective, I think it's slightly different to the industry, although you might be able with the Bumble to speak about that. But like, from a research perspective, I'm working on a network called the Violence Against Women and Girls Mental Health Network, and it's very much about, like, we call it LEAGUE, which is the Lived Experience Advisory Group, which is a group of people that have experienced violence, trauma, and they inform our research on a day-to-day practice. So basically, if we organize panel events, if we work on a research bid, if we publish a paper, we basically are greatly profiting by speaking to them to get their input on everything we're doing. So from an academic perspective, we do try to work with people, and not to say that academics have not probably undergone trauma as well and lived experience, but like that is at least this third party independent that can feed into that. When it comes to more the technological design of it, and again, like I think Naomi can speak to the experience that Chan has, but like I think there's less yet a recognition to a certain extent to do that. But I think coming to the question of like the generations that, well, I mean, like I'm looking into the room and I don't want to make assumptions, but like we're kind of, God, I hope I'm not going to step on anyone's toes here, but like, I think I suspect I'm talking about myself, Phil. I'm this kind of generation that like I've kind of grown up with it, but I definitely not like I haven't had it like I had my first phone with 12. And then like that wasn't a smartphone, and I've grown into it. So I certainly can relate to this period which was prior to what we have now. And I think like the generations that come now, certainly for them and I realized this day to day going into a course and like looking at the age groups that I'm facing now in the classroom that like have grown up with social media platforms and just being online constantly. And I think definitely I think we haven't found like both from a technical perspective to deal with that, like security and safety aspect, but also like from a human perspective of what that does to people. We have enough studies to showcase, okay, there is some sort of effect that like, what it does, for example, like the recent leak of Facebook, that they knew, for example, that Instagram had a certain effect on like women and girls when it comes to eating disorders. But like, what does that mean? Like I think, and who will hold them accountable, I think is the big question. So I think there's yet a lot of open questions, and especially I am very concerned. We have a generation, I am the generation of PC, personal computer. So you have one device, one owner, and we're going into an environment where we're going into a collective, shared digital device ecosystem. And like I think that is one thing that keeps me awake at night, because I feel like we have engineering solutions or security solutions that say, okay, I have one password and like this is my password, and if I try to get Edie's phone, I can't go into it because I don't know your password or they don't have your biometrics. But if we're thinking about like where we're headed now, which is like soon here will be smart, probably they are already, some internet connected and network connected like devices, where just by us being present in this room, we all kind of, by just having entered here, agreed to our data being shared. But I don't think that is just where we are now, but that's not where we should be. And we can talk about consent in general. I think when this is a question of consent, like coming here, I might not be aware that these devices are here. And so I think we need to find still technical solution of dealing with these shared environments, but then also like kind of societally, are we all equally comfortable with using them? And I think currently we're more coerced into this. So there's interesting parallels with abuse in this regard.
Just on the tech design thing. So when we talk about like trauma-informed design, in terms of design and technology, like that's something that we, being a wholly digital organisation that supports survivors of abuse, that's something that we've sort of been experimenting and learning about from the beginning. And we have developed over the years basically kind of like a set of principles that we think that you can apply to create like digital products and services that are trauma-informed. And obviously when we're doing that, we are actively creating digital products and services which are for the healing survivors. So it's like very obvious why they should be trauma-informed. But we would equally say, for the reasons outlined, that actually the vast majority of people have experienced some sort of trauma, that they should apply to the design of all digital products and services, and actually also non-digital products and services as well. And I won't go into all of them because there's quite a lot of them. But just to like give an example of a couple of them and what they look like in practice. So one of them is agency. And the reason that we think that's really important is that if you are a survivor of gender-based violence, that will often have involved your agency and your power and control of your life being taken away from you completely. And getting that back and getting back this feeling of agency over your own life is like a really, really important part of recovery process, and of course like consent also is a big part of this, so like having not consented to something and then it being taken away, and equally as was also touched upon, you know, everyone's healing journey is very, very different, everyone's experience of trauma is different, and so what is going to work for them is going to be different, and thus the only way that you can design something which will work for someone is if you give them agency on how they engage with that product or service, or you know the way that they can use it. So to give you an example of what that looks like in practice, we have an online trauma support program called Bloom, which essentially tries to replicate the sort of support you might get in a sort of group support setting, but online in a completely anonymous and private space. And the way that it runs is live courses. So we have a course on recovering from abusive relationships. We have a course on healing from sexual trauma. We have several more, and they run for periods of time live. It's all pre-recorded and pre-written content, so nothing. You don't have to join anything live, but you get the messages and you get the content. You know, according to a set schedule, which is the sort of schedule that we have. You know, recommended as being one which takes you through a continuous process, but also hopefully isn't too overwhelming. But the way that we deliver that, you absolutely do not have to stick to that schedule. So we send you the videos, we send you the content, but we say, and we do that 2 or 3 times a week, but we say you watch these in your own time. There is a live chat element of the program and of the courses where people can chat to us directly via WhatsApp or Telegram, and we keep access to that open for several months after the course, so that if people, rather than watching 3 videos a week, are watching 1, or even watching maybe 1 a month, because that's as much as they can take at that time, they're able to do that. Equally, it's the reason that we do all the videos pre-recorded rather than live, so that people can watch them whenever they want. We make sure that all of the videos are captioned, so people can, if they want, you know, watch it on their commute, on their phone. We also do transcripts, so people would rather read rather than there's all of it. So it's basically creating like as many different options for people to then like tailor that healing experience to what works for them, and to give them that agency. Another one of our principles, which I think is really, really important and like certainly should apply to most tech products, is hope. And by that, what we mean is, you know, someone who has experienced gender-based violence or any other sort of trauma, you know, you can feel very hopeless and you feel like that things can't get better. And that's, you know, I think something you could argue that like with the climate crisis and COVID and a lot of other stuff going on, there's a sort of society level trauma in regards to hope in a lot of ways at the moment. So we try to design all of our products and services to give some of that hope back, and some of that is just like really, really, really simple things like our design, our UX. So like if you go onto our website, everything is very sort of calm and soothing. We don't use harsh colours or harsh words. We don't use like imagery of abuse. We use imagery of people in healing situations that sort of evoke happy, calming emotions to give some of that hope. In the courses for the Bloom program that I just mentioned, we make sure to do grounding exercises in all of the videos, which are just like short exercises. There might be like some sort of physical activity, it might be just a breathing exercise, it might be something more mental, but that will just provide someone with a few minutes of like respite from their day to then like remind them like that's still possible, like no matter how chaotic and, you know, awful you might feel now, there's like these pockets of hope. You know, and I think principles like that are something that, like really should just be part of all design of technology products that kind of beyond.
Yeah, 100%. So, but the trauma-informed element of this is also, you know, engaging with people and saying, you know, survivors, and saying, okay, how can we formulate this so to best serve you? What do you want out of it? How can you fit this into your life? And then developing the material and the content in that way. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I mean, we do that sort of in 2 ways. So one is that our modelers, we have a small staff team and we work with a large volunteer network, and like everyone is involved in the design process of everything that we do, and like the vast majority of Chen's team and wider volunteer network are survivors, and so in that sense that sort of like lived experience is built in from the get-go. But then we also do extensive user research with survivors, and also there can be sort of more intentional to about making sure that we are speaking to like lots of different survivors and different experiences of abuse, different from different parts of the world with different other aspects of their identity that are marginalised, different sexualities and gender identities and so forth, and then make sure that we're using all of their insights in design products as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree that even just beyond digital tools, that should be extended everywhere. Because there was another example in Maid in the Netflix series where she needed subsidized daycare in order to get a job, but she needed a job to get subsidized daycare. It's just like that kind of like, what? And it's clearly an instance of people who have no idea of what the actual lived experience of being in that situation is, kind of coming up with the policies, however well intended they may be. So I think that what you've just spoken about really hammers home the importance of really involving and engaging the people with lived experiences in the development of the tools that are meant to help and protect them. And I wonder, to some extent, maybe we'll have to wait for the generation to grow up to then actually talk about their lived experiences, or maybe don't even wait, just engage them now. Just engage them and ask them what needs to be done to protect them in that sense, in that sphere. Great. Well, I think so. We've covered abuse. We've covered trauma. Naomi, I think you've talked about healing and those steps and what is important for people to heal, and that's agency and what was it? Hope.
Yeah.
And
there's many more principles, but we won't need to go through all of them.
Yeah. But in terms of healing and action, and I guess this is the call to action. So what I also wanted to touch upon, and I think it has been discussed as well. What are the biggest challenges do you see to implementing, trauma-informed approaches, to setting boundaries, to having greater open discussions around trauma? Everybody having experienced different types of trauma, but it is probably inevitable that most people have, and also getting away perhaps from misconceptions around what is abuse and that. So with all of the wonderful things that we've spoken about today and the direction that we want to head in, what do you see? What keeps you up at night? I think you said, but and then we'll end on a happier note than that. But I'm just interested to hear your thoughts.
I mean, it's such a good question. I mean, like, I try to tie it back to the film and also the film industry, and I think I think the way we're portraying abuse is a really important one, but also I think a really interesting thing that I think a lot about is we're now in this really odd environment where we have some level of awareness. There was Me Too. People have, I would say, the horizon has been opened and the discussion has started, but equally, there's a big backlash as well. And I feel that the same thing applies not just to the discussion around abuse, but also for example with technology. And what I normally tend to say, and I feel like a broken record, is in the environment where we're at now, I feel like both the overestimation of the abuse and the capabilities of technologies is just as dangerous as the underestimation. What I mean with that is, we have films Hollywood films that shows, we have Scarlett Johansson as the new AI of Her and whatnot, that can do all these amazing things. We have even Oral-B. If you go on, they don't have those adverts anymore, but on the tube it said, brush your teeth with AI supported information, and it's just no, it's not, it's just Bluetooth connected to toothbrush. But I think we have all these overhyped things where we're actually, I'm not saying you, but the film industry feeds into that, and all the documentaries and we have Black Mirror, and so there's nearly this we're kind of like the deer that sees the light coming, but we don't know what to do, so we just stand there for a second and wait. And I think this overestimation is just as dangerous as what we see with the underestimation, where we see perpetrators deliberately not sharing certain information about what technologies can do. That brings them, victims and survivors, in this gaslighting situation where they start to kind of think, has he read my messages, or how on earth did he know, or she know, or they know that I was there and meeting them. And like, you know, so there is certainly functionalities, especially in technology, but which are there, and that when people do not know that this is able, that devices and systems are capable of doing this, could also feel equally as entrapped as if they're thinking, oh my god, my Roomba smart vacuum cleaner has knives and cameras in it, which perhaps it doesn't, you know. And so I think like this is, I think like that's one thing. I think like I don't know if that really answers your question, but like that's something that I certainly feel like is really important for me from an educational perspective to not just communicate like to the students and the support sector. I mean, the support sector is well aware of everything anyway, so like I mainly learn more from the support sector often than the other way around. So you know, but also like kind of this educational experience of like speaking to the public about this, because I think like, well, we have David Attenborough explaining, you know, I can never say this term. Conservation. I always say conservatism. I don't know if David Attenborough does that, but like I don't think we have an equivalent like on the BBC, on all the other outlets that does the same thing when it comes to tech. And instead we have more kind of like this hype things of like the Steve Jobs of this world, not anymore, but like of like, you know, selling us the new iPhone and all the things that are great, but nobody that does it in a more critical way. So yeah, that's my rant over. And I know this doesn't really tie too much with the abuse, but I think like it certainly is enabling an environment where especially people that are using technology in a harmful way can use that against people that they exploit their anxieties equally as their lack of knowledge.
Well, no, I think that's simple. You need to call a spade, whether or not it's like a smart spade or a stupid spade or somewhere in between. You know, but you still need to be able to talk about it in an accurate way in order to mitigate any potential risks or existing risks.
Yeah, and assess the risk and the safety measures that you need to implement.
Yeah. To just jump onto that for a second, because like there's so many directions which I could talk about what barriers there are and what needs to happen, but from a storytelling standpoint. With intimacy and you know, there are the situations in which intimacy and violence overlap, like portrayals of sexual trauma or sexual violence on screen, and you see that sort of sensationalized story that gets perpetuated, which has very, very real world consequences when we talk about victims of sexual abuse or violence, where you know, I grew up watching in America, where I'm from, Law and Order SVU, where you have, I mean, I've spent so many hours on that show, right? And you see in there, you know, there's a lot that, especially in the context of the 90s, like primetime TV, that did a lot to promote awareness about various types of trauma and abuse and violence against women and children and men and, you know, people existing outside of the gender binary, I think, at a certain point. I think maybe they got there, actually. Maybe I'm giving them more credit. But shows of that nature, and also films that sensationalize like sex in any form, but also sex and violence. You see this perpetuation of the narrative of sort of like dark, evil man in the alleyway being the greatest threat to a woman on her walk home. And we see in sort of the news and the media this sensationalization of those sorts of stories, and particularly in America, the sort of like, you know, innocent white woman who, you know, was just a you know, innocent in whatever way the media makes that.
Creating her identity for her. In some
Yeah, exactly. And those stories getting told and getting amplified to the degree then negate the fact that so much violence against women and children happens in the home, happens from a trusted loved one or a family member, you know, a romantic partner. And I think that for me, it is that difficult tension I was talking about, where like I am fundamentally, I do have a health and safety role on set, but obviously I come with my own creative opinions and how we tell stories about intimacy and violence and harm, and the overlap of that, I think is something that is changing slightly, but needs to continue to change, because there is a direct connection between storytelling and education. Until we have fundamentally like flawless, robust sexual education and education about violence and trauma and all of that, you know, young people especially gain so much information from these stories. And it's interesting how much gaslighting has been talked about in this session. Well, because it stems from a film, Gaslight.
Oh, yeah.
With Ingrid Bergman. Well, play first, yeah. Actually, thank you.
I know both.
But you know, did you? Oh. And I watched that movie when I was quite young with Ingrid Bergman, and it was something that, like, you know, my family, like, we've seen a few times, and it's interesting because that's a film from the 40s, I want to say, the early 40s, not late 30s, and that has obviously entered our common parlance and an understanding of a certain, you know, circumstance and situation that we see manifest in a lot of different ways. But I think that's a really interesting example of how a story has directly informed our language and our style of communication around that. So I think for me, the greatest challenge, I think consistently, is representation of a diversity of experiences and a diversity and, like, nuance within those experiences, but also the ways that informs how we can then communicate and talk about them. Because that's where I see the sort of the intrinsic connection between my work as a storyteller and my work as an advocate for change. It's how I justify doing what I love for a living. But storytelling does have a direct impact on how we think and then how we behave and how we relate to one another. And so the more diverse and representative those can become, and the more informed and intelligent they can be, and the more expansive and accessible the people who are telling those stories, like with the industry, and brings in more storytellers, I suppose, the better off I hope we'll be. But right now there are so many barriers to inclusion and access that are getting in the way of that, and allowing those stories to repeat. So until they sort of, I don't know, expand out of there, I think that's the greatest barrier I'm seeing.
Yeah. No, I love that as well. I mean, don't let anyone tell you that a bureaucrat is more powerful than a storyteller. I don't know. It just it seeps in, doesn't it? And colors how you view behaviors and interactions and others. So it's very I think that's a really good point. What about you, Andy?
Yeah, I'm so glad you made that point about gaslighting, because I always forget that that's where it comes from. But it is actually so true that I have I haven't seen the film, but I did watch a play version, and it's like the best and like most accurate like depiction of coercive control that you can possibly imagine. And you just think, like, if everybody watched that at school and was like, this is what abuse looks like, we would like already be in like a much better place.
And there's no violence in it.
Yeah,
no
exactly.
Physical violence.
Yeah.
And for context, for those who haven't seen it, and go. I would recommend it. It's great film. But it is the gas lights in the house. It was like, it's set in the sort of the turn of the 20th century, where gaslighting was just coming into houses, and so when you would turn a light on in one room, it would cause the other lights to flicker because it would affect the gas. And this the male partner has been going up into the attic and doing all this stuff, blah, 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 but like he'll turn the lights on upstairs and they'll flicker, and the female lead will sort of go, somebody's in the attic because the lights were flickering. He's like, no, they weren't. And he's like, are you imagining things? And then that's how it starts. So it all comes from this one device within a story that's very grounded in the context of that narrative, but now has become this ubiquitous term for it.
Yeah.
So
just, no, thank you.
In case everyone was like, I don't understand.
I think in terms of the key barriers I see to like progress on all of this stuff, like firstly, I would agree with Leonie. I think the tech thing is huge, and I think like the fast pace and like fast evolving and changing nature of like technology and the way that it's been used to perpetrate abuse is like something that is of humongous worry, particularly because like we still haven't won the narrative on gender-based violence in general. So like if we were in a place where like we had like good public understanding, good policy, good public services, etc. for more traditional forms of gender-based violence, and then the tech thing happened, it would still be a big problem. But it's like we're trying to, for example, get technology facilitated sexual violence and understood to be violence, when we still haven't like won the argument on sexual violence in general yet, and there's still so much misinformation and misunderstanding about sexual violence in general. So I think that is definitely a huge one. And then I think the second one is just the fact that this is also, all of this stuff happens in the context of the world and all of the systems of oppression of the world, of which, of course, like patriarchy is one, but equally racism, equally transphobia, equally homophobia, equally inequality, and so forth. And that, really, really shapes our like ability to have progress on these issues. So, for example, in the UK recently, the domestic abuse bill came in, which is something that organisations have been campaigning for and working for a really, really long time, and that was like that's a fantastic, amazing thing, which puts us in a much, much better position. But like refugee women have been excluded from that bill, despite the fact that pretty much every single gender-based violence organisation in the country was saying this like has to be part of it. You can't say you're supporting survivors if you exclude this group of victims, but then this is going on in the context of like the hostile environment, and so that's going to then affect the way that solutions to gender-based violence are, and that happens in various different ways, like how wider transphobia then affects the experience of trans survivors, like, and I think there's also just that, is that all of the other horrendous things that happen in the world, of which gender-based violence is one, and that also shapes the solutions and services that are available to people. It shapes the narratives and conversations we're able to have as a result of it, and yeah, that is a huge barrier.
Sorry, no, please, no.
No, I was just going to say, and I would really agree that I think storytelling and telling more stories has a really, really important role to play in shifting some of that.
Yeah, and I think this the intersectionality and how we really need to put that inform our solutions as well. I think goes back to just the importance of representation in the decision-making process, but also having those folk actually be there and drafting the policies as well, so that when all those various charities come together and say, no, we as experts recommend this, that you have advocates in the decision-making process saying, yes, okay, here we go. Ali, turn it to you. What do you in your field, what do you see as the biggest challenge, and what would you like to see more of?
It's similar to what everyone's saying here, in the sense of, especially through technology, the faster I think what Leonie mentioned there about overestimating the threat is really, really interesting and important, because what happens is people tend to overcomplicate what they need to do for their own personal safety, when some of it is actually quite simple. But because there's such an overwhelm of information on what's potentially going to threaten you or cause you harm or risk, sometimes it does paralyse you into thinking you're not able to do anything, when in actual fact there's some really simple things you can do to keep yourself safe online, even going down to two-factor authentication. There is some really simple stuff that helps you to protect yourself, but there's again this sort of information overload that can often just leave people in that state of paralysis. So that's a challenge, because there are multiple platforms to gain that advice and information from now, and it's really good to hear we talk about how intuitive their software is for change to be able to create trauma-informed spaces for people. So it's also that hope element of that. Whilst the digital space can be seen as threatening, it's also a very supportive space if it's done right. So that technology that, say, a hacker's using to harm someone could be the same technology that's being used to help people. So it's quite interesting that it's a big challenge, but it's also an opportunity as well. And I think when I feel like we are in this big point in time of systemic change, right? So we know that the system has to change. If I zoom out, it's about system change. Everything to do with this, including the climate, is about system change. But when a system is on the point of collapse, and people who've been used to power for a very long amount of time, they're going to start, resisting. There is going to be resistance, and it's going to come from all elements. So digital being one of them, physical being another. And so I think the more we talk a lot about intersectionality here, but what does that really mean? Where are we intersecting? And I think it's something we have to focus on almost in everything that we do. How does one thing relate to another? Because it's only by weaving those threads together that you can almost create some kind of armour from the different things that are going to come and try and destabilise this quite significant change in how we identify ourselves, how we represent ourselves, how we express ourselves is fighting this like hundreds of years of, I know we could keep going on about the patriarchy, but it is, that system of power has been in place a long time and it's being threatened. So the things that challenge us are, in my view, related to that. So the importance around those trauma-informed spaces is key. I also think that within the film industry, as in a wider context, it's not just about the stories that are represented, it's about who is doing it, who is behind the camera, who is the DOP, who is the producer, who's the director, who's the runner, who's actually writing the script. Those are key, because what I've seen in the past is it could be an all-white crew, an all-white male crew doing the story. It does matter, because it does change the way that some things are reflected. And certainly I'd love to see better representation within class systems, a lot of intershadowation and working class people. When it talks about domestic violence, you see the same archetypes being presented all the time, and it lacks the nuance of the reality of being at economic disadvantage. And same with like more marginalised voices. So if those people aren't enabled to get behind a camera and start making their own films, it won't change. So I think we've touched on sort of class here and privilege. So those things are another thing that we need to work towards as well, like literally just sitting and looking around the room at who's with you, who's sat in this conversation, who's interested in these subjects. That's on all of us really, to be some agents of change in that space. Sorry, I've talked more about like the optimistic side of it rather than
that's
what are the challenges, because I think we know the challenges, we're embodying them all the time, but we have to look beyond. Well, everything in capitalism has been capitalised, hasn't it? So like self-care has become an industry in its own right. But I think about self-care now, it's about how can I enable myself to look at things like collective care. How do we give resource and space and have soft boundaries, but also are able to support one another as we move through this very difficult kind of timing where it's asymmetric threats. It's not just like one thing, it's like coming from different angles, So creating that sort of support network to do more authentic storytelling that's from, a range of perspectives, not just a single one. I'll shut up now. That's a lot.
No, Ali, thanks for taking us home. That was great. No, so I think with that, it's interesting. So and it ties into what you were saying, Leonie, as well, is we need to face the threats head on, also acknowledge when we ourselves are perpetuating maybe some damaging concepts around trauma and inclusion. We shouldn't all just automatically pat ourselves on the back for even having this panel, and I think looking around and saying, okay, who's missing from here? How can we, what can we do to include them in future conversations around this? I also think a really big theme, kind of touching upon how do we find that intersection is also connecting in this way, and I love that an intimacy coordinator is sitting down from a research lecturer at UCL on online security, and so I think that there are tools that perhaps we can learn and exchange with each other, and another one is meaningful and nuanced inclusion of people's lived experiences beyond just the to be honest, beyond just maybe the shared ones that we have up here now. But so I would like to end then on maybe a slightly cringy bit, but what about the things that each of you have spoken about today? Are there any particular tools or new bits of information or new challenges that actually you want to take away in your respective fields and incorporate? So this idea of sharing and exchanging tools and ideas and building up a stronger kind of collective, movement for it.
Renewed attention on storytelling. We talk about storytelling at Chen a lot, and I think in the non-profit space, like in general, we talk about it a lot, but it's like something that when you're a small organisation with limited resources and limited time, can often like fall to the bottom of the pile. And like we have so many like fantastic stories of like transformations that survivors have been on, maybe through volunteering with Chen or for using one of the services or whatever. And I think this discussion has like reminded me how important it is to invest time in like telling those stories properly, because that just can be so powerful.
Adelaide?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about it. I think it's an interesting, like, being part of an industry that is still forming itself whilst also like existing in a wider industry that's existed for so long. I feel like I'm constantly reevaluating and pushing and pulling within my just sort of my professional community as to what our job is or isn't. And you know, I think in discussions like this, I am kind of the one where I'm like, well, in stories, because fundamentally I work with this in a very specific sphere, and even within the arts sphere, I'm not HR, I'm not a mental health professional, I'll say it again, and I'm not, you know, there's well-being coordinators now and well-being facilitators who are coming into sets that are working on sort of mental health and personal safety and that sort of thing. So I think it's always a helpful reminder for me that the scope of what my profession does and is for, we're constantly working to explain what we do, but then also to sort of remind people what we don't do. And within this, like, my ability to affect storytelling and my ability to sort of also help my industry avoid some of the pitfalls that we've arisen to mitigate against in the wider TV and film industry, if that makes sense. Like, that's been a constant drive for me within this, is to keep the intimacy industry from becoming one that weaponizes patriarchal power structures, because like, what's the point if we're all doing that to each other when we're literally there to stop that from happening? But then also just to uplift more of the people who are working on a variety of other kinds of traumatic experiences within the industry that have nothing to do with an intimate scene, whatever that may or may not be. And yeah, I think that's something that I'm always reminded of when I'm on set, when I do find myself sort of involved in something that really isn't my job, but there's nobody there to do, is that a comprehensive and sort of broader change in the entire workings of the industry, which is starting to happen in small ways, are the only way to kind of fully support. It's sort of like what you said, Naomi, the fact that like the bigger fight hasn't happened, so to get into the little nuanced bits can be difficult when you still have some certain fundamental problems that have not been sorted out. And I think it's easy to get distracted by the nuanced kind of very specific like other things, like when there's some fundamental issues and some fundamental disadvantages that are continuing to let the same people down over and over again. So yeah, it's been a really helpful reminder of that within my profession, but then also within the wider industry and the ways that it's all very interconnected. Yeah, I'm very grateful to have so many different. Just very grateful for this.
I mean, like, I think, so I can speak about like the engineering profession. I think I like, perhaps like I am hopeful. You said I should mention this.
Yes.
I don't see it all doom and gloom. Like, I think, like, I mean, again, I for one, I see it the way we're like students are being introduced, not necessarily to the topic of domestic abuse, but like to societal issues that they would realize, okay, actually, you know, we can't fix everything with tech. Although I think that mentality is still there, but it's slowly changing. And I also see it with colleagues that are, you know, in industry, but also in academia, and like start to develop products that they are forced by policy decisions, by activism, by people just calling out like certain dimensions to rethink the way that they're developing products. So I'm hopeful in this regard. And just generally, if the question is also about tools that I can share, I mean, like, if anyone is feeling, you know, of course I would point them to a professional service like Chen or other services that are out there when it comes to, you know, domestic abuse. But if specifically when technology is involved, I think there's even more necessity to think about, like, you know, the way you're going to be tracked, surveilled, etc., to be careful and considerate that if you go in contact with support services, that might, you know, leave traces. And thankfully, you know, the support sectors have addressed this by having an exit button and God knows what. But like, you know, I just bring up that idea that like if that's something you're worried about, there's specialized services as well. And for example, we are running a newsletter where we try to, you know, provide information around like the developments in this space. We're not like giving advice because that's left to the experts in this field, but like kind of more for people that are interested in this space on what's happening on the policy level, in the research level, but also in charities and specialized services that might be of interest.
No, so we will have if people want to sign up to a mailing list to just keep up to date with all of the good work of these people, and also the film, we'll have that for you to sign. But all right, take us home again, Ali. Are there any tools that you that you would like to share, or anything that you've heard from the other speakers that maybe you haven't thought about incorporating in your work?
I think tools-wise, the last year we've done two different things. We've just launched a personal safety guide for women and non-binary people called By Us For You, that was done with a collective of people in the West Midlands, and there's some formal safety advice in there. And it started off with a request to do a self-defence guide, which ended up being 6 pages long, and the rest of it is all got like nearly 100 pages, which focuses on the biopsychosocial side of safety, and also everything from consent to red flags to gaslighting, and you know, personal essays and poems by people who've experienced a lot of these different issues. We wanted to make it as representative as we could. So that was launched last week, and it's free as a PDF, so I'll send a link afterwards so you can download it and have a look. And we're just at the end of a programme to finish training 14 women and queer folk to be media safety trainers in the US next year, because we're given an opportunity to do that over there, which we're hoping to do here at some point. So I think we did a bit of direct action, I guess, and decided to try and influence and change that space. And we were really aware that most of the journalists we work with were being taught safety from a white male perspective. And so we've got 14 trainers now who are about to graduate, who represent the wider journalistic community better, I feel. So I think those are the two kind of things that I can share around what we're working on, and it's always evolving, you know, as everything is right now. And things I've just taken away is just listening to this sort of what seems like a real collective thought on sort of storytelling again, and who tells the story. I think it just comes up so much in all the work that we do, and it's kind of the fabric of what we do as well, because we are our stories, right? So I think it just reminds me of like there's no prescribed way to teach anything. Even in digital security, there's an adaptation depending on how someone reads that or how they use their bit of text. So so listening to everyone speak today on their perspective, I can see so much commonality as well, which is like reassuring.
Well, thank you all for coming and for bearing with some of the technical glitches. Please give a big round of applause to the amazing panelists. So River Take Me, the film, is going to complete in early Feb. So if you'd like to sign up to the mailing list, find out more, as well as more about Chan, Adelaide's devised theatre group Maud, and then of course Leonie's. No, you definitely want to hear about it. And of course ROAAR as well. So if you want to keep up to date with all of that, please do sign up. And otherwise, thank you so much for coming, and I hope it was interesting, and please make use of the bar.